All right, I guess we can go ahead and get started. Hopefully we'll have some more people jumping in as we go along. So first of all, my name is Anna Weber. I'm a graduate student at the University of New Orleans. For those of you who don't know me, I'm the organizer and the moderator for this panel. I really want to thank everyone, first of all, for being here. There was a lot of work that went into organizing this, and really excited to see it come to fruition. So before we get started with this discussion, I'd like to say a little bit about the organization that is hosting this, which is the Society for Conservation Biology. So, oops, where's my slide? There it is. Okay, so Society 7 different sections, geographic sections that are all actively involved in conservation within their own regions. So we're part of the North American section, which includes the US and Canada. So members can join the regional sections. They can also join local chapters, and they can join working groups, which are active in specific topics within conservation. SCB also publishes 3 different academic journals, and it holds regional conferences or regional and international conferences on a regular basis. So SCB North America held their conference in Reno, Nevada just this past year. And then in 2024, it will be in Vancouver, Canada. And then just next year, 2023, is the International Congress for Conservation Biology, which will be in Rwanda. So it's really exciting. So it is a really great organization, and it does allow members a lot of different ways to be involved in conservation and lots of opportunities for professional development. We also are trying to provide a lot of resources specifically to students. So I'm the current chair of the Student Affairs Committee as of just this past July. So this panel is my first bit of programming as part of this role. So if you find this event useful, we're having a part 2, which is going to be Monday evening, just 1 hour later. And that panel will be of graduate students and postdocs instead of faculty. So I'll put a link to registration for that event in the chat if you're interested in joining for that event. A couple of things we have going on. The Student Affairs Committee has recently opened up a Slack workspace. It is intended for students and postdocs in conservation sciences. It's meant to be for networking, for sharing resources, asking questions, and building relationships among early career conservationists. So this workspace just became public a few days ago. So far it's really quiet, but the more people we have involved, the better it's going to be. So I will also put the link to join that in the chat if any of you would like to jump in. Over the next year, we're also hoping to host some kind of skill building professional development webinars, especially in statistics and data management. So there was a lot of enthusiasm for that, potentially scientific communication. So keep an eye out for those as they come up. And finally, if any of you are current members of SCB and you're interested in helping out and planning any of these events, you can go ahead and shoot me an email if you're interested in joining the Student Affairs Subcommittee. So I'll go ahead and paste some of these relevant links into the chat. And while we do that, I would like to go ahead and have our panelists introduce themselves. Whoever wants to go first.
No one? Maybe I'll start then. As the lone Canadian on the panel. So hi everyone, I'm Gerald Singh. I'm an assistant professor and Ocean Nexus chair in global change and sustainable development at the University of Victoria. I'm the outgoing, well, I guess now outgone officer of EDI for Society for Conservation Biology North America.
Hi, I'm Jen Solomon, and I'm an associate professor at Colorado State University in the Department of Human Dimensions of Natural Resources. And I teach in a graduate program. I teach undergrad and grad classes, but the graduate program that I'm very involved in is called the Conservation Leadership Through Learning Program. So I'm a conservation social scientist.
And hi, everybody. My name's Travis Seaborn. I am an assistant professor in the School of Natural Resource Sciences at North Dakota State University, specifically in applied ecology. I was one of 2 hires focused on climate change, and I'm in the natural systems side of things. I've also only been in my position now for about 4.5-ish months. So I will be deferring to Jen and Gerald for a lot of some of the questions you might have, but maybe I can weigh in a bit in terms of transition questions that maybe folks have, or job market type questions. My background's in landscape genetics, conservation genetics, and a little bit of landscape ecology work as well.
Hello, my name's Nikki Anthony. I'm at the University of New Orleans. I'm a professor and endowed chair in wildlife sustainability. I've been working mostly in Central Africa for the last 20 years, probably on the evolution and conservation of Central African biodiversity, but my students work on a whole range of projects, and more recently we started working on a consortium to look at the genetic basis to seagrass resiliency in the face of climate change and other environmental stresses. And thanks for inviting me, Hannah.
Sorry, I was muted. Thanks everyone for those great introductions. You can go ahead and get started if anybody has any questions they want to ask our panelists. There were a few that were submitted online, so we can also do those if there's nobody who has anything right now.
Yeah, actually, I have a question. I'm Courtney Babin, by the way. I was curious as to what the traditional path for those interested in an academic career might be, and if maybe each of you could speak a little bit on those paths that you have taken.
So I'll chime in. I'm not sure what the traditional path is anymore. I think, historically we saw a lot of folks continuing directly on from undergrad and doing a master's, or there used to be cases, and there still are, where folks just jumped right into a PhD program and then did a postdoc. But nowadays, and I think this is a good idea. I see a lot of students going after undergrad, going on to continue and get some experience in the field, figure out what they really enjoy doing, what they like, and then making that decision whether grad school is the correct next step for them. And if they want to be in academia, going on to get a PhD, and then typically the postdoc. Sometimes you can make the jump from a non-academic career into an academic career, but typically that's not the case. And I'd be curious to hear what Travis and Gerald and other folks have to say.
Yeah, I can go next. I mean, I think what Jen's pointed out is largely accurate. And as a first generation academic, when I was, I guess, navigating this kind of career, it's really concerning how many academics are second generation and up, meaning that a lot of times the trajectory for going to an academia starts with decisions that predate you a lot of the time. It's a very strange career path in how kind of self-selected it is. So I don't say this to necessarily make you jaded, but it is something to consider. And especially, there's a lot of statistics for kind of academic careers, especially for America, and the emphasis on being within the culture of academia. So there's a recent report showing that 80% of tenure track career offers in America come from about 5 schools in the US. It's very prestige based. That's in general. So I would say that the good thing about conservation and more applied disciplines is that I think there's a lot more value placed on experience outside of academia. So for example, for me, one of the things I look for if I'm looking at a student's, or I'm looking to fulfill kind of a spot for a master's student or a PhD, I like seeing experience outside the university. I know a number of my colleagues that's similar to them. They care a lot less about grades than they do about experience, but conservation is kind of rare in that regard. Most academic fields, I think, especially disciplinary ones, how well you do in school, which often follows, do you have a parent who knows how kind of schools work and have worked in that system? And they want to see you do well in school and not veer off. So it's kind of a tough question, I guess, in that way. But I think conservation, the nice thing is that diverse experiences can be beneficial. But a lot of times it's, and I know I'm taking up too much time here, but I'll just finish and say, I would say part of it is if you're interested in that career, find a supervisor who kind of follows, has the same kind of values you do, and appreciates the kind of experiences you have and are willing to have in the future.
Yeah, so I'll say I'm also first gen, and so I was more or less kind of what I would say typical path, but I didn't really come across like ecology and conservation until later in undergrad. Like my first experience doing like field ecology work was, near my senior year. And I was like, oh, this is awesome. This is way better than some of the other research things I've been involved in. But because that, like my timing was off a little bit. So, I think I worked like 18 months, about 2 years between undergrad and my master's. And, I think one of the things I struggled with that transition too was, like I went into undergrad thinking like, oh, you go so you can be like a doctor or a lawyer or engineer. That's probably nursing. That's probably all of the things I could state up front. And so the idea of like cold emailing folks was all just like very intimidating and awkward and kind of weird. Once I got into my master's, part of that was also driven by the fact that I was like, well, at least for the state that I was in, which was Washington, a lot of the Fish and Wildlife positions required masters, or that was their preferred qualification. And so I was like, well, I'll do a master's and I'll kind of see if I like that or if I like academia. And then I, got into like teaching and mentoring and fell in love with those pieces. So I did, my master's degree into a PhD. My grades were not stellar from undergrad. So the master's was kind of a way to like open up more doors. Post PhD, did a postdoc for about 3 years out of what was a 5-year grant. That was like a publicly advertised type of postdoc thing that I was very thankful to be involved in. And then that's what's led me here. And I think I'll just add to that in terms of like connecting with those folks who can appreciate your experience in navigating things that are a bit foreign can be really helpful. So like that person I did the field ecology work, Emily Carrington at University of Washington, was great because she was like, no, you've never thought about grad school? Well, why not? So like let's talk about it and what that would look like, and really helped kind of like open my eyes. So I think having those early mentors was really, really helpful for me.
Well, I can maybe add to the diversity of opinions here, all of which I agree with. I actually came to conservation from a sort of somewhat circuitous route. My parents, or I should say my family is rooted more in medical sciences and not in ecology and evolution and conservation. So that was sort of, for me, quite a difficult path to navigate, if you will. I actually started off doing a sort of degree in general zoology, and then I went on to do a PhD in insect neurobiology, and then decided that I really wasn't very happy doing what I was doing. So I went to Peru and spent 6 months working in a tropical rainforest and decided that was what I really wanted to do. But I just didn't quite know how to get there. And that was back in the day when we didn't have internet or browsers or any of that stuff. So so I kind of made the switch to conservation by going back after my PhD to get a master's degree in conservation biology and sustainable development about, I don't know, 6 or 7 years after my PhD. And I would say that gave me a springboard upon which I could, expand and really explore my conservation career. And so I ended up moving to Africa, and that was it really for me. But it was quite a difficult journey, and I would just say I had a lot of self-doubt, but I think I always knew what I wanted to be. I just didn't quite know how to get there. And I would second the opinions that were made earlier that it's really important to get out and get some fieldwork experience, get some practical hands-on experience. I took years off, several years off actually, one to work in Peru, another to study French in France, which actually served me very well because now I work in Francophone here. So I would just say that it's really important to keep your options open and to test the waters in lots of different ways. And I was a terminal postdoc. I mean, I actually postdoc for 10 years, but I don't actually regret a single minute of that. Because I came through the UK system where you finish your PhD very early in life, like 24, 25, I had quite a lot of time to sort of figure things out. And I realize in the US it's not quite so easy, but I would definitely not be afraid of taking time out to experiment and figure out what it is and what direction you want to take. That's my 2 cents anyway.
Cool, thanks everybody. We'll take another question in just a second, but one thing I forgot to mention earlier that I need to bring up is that the session is being recorded. I apologize for not mentioning that earlier, but just let me know if we need to work out anything different for anybody who wants to ask something and doesn't want to be recorded. Just shoot me a message in the chat if you need to. Okay, so thanks. That was really great insight for Courtney's question. Does anybody else want to follow up with another question, or I can take one from the list from the Google survey? Okay, the question in the chat. This is what happens if you are a po' boy from a po' family, but you want to help save the world. I want a paid master's in Louisiana. How do I get this coming out of my undergrad? Okay, so I think the question is about funding graduate school, maybe as a low-income student. What kind of options are out there? Maybe especially in Louisiana, if that's there. I know Nikki's from Louisiana.
I'm from the UK originally, but I've lived in Louisiana for 20 years. So I would sort of respond to Brett by just saying that we do have TA support within the department. And I'm just speaking about my own university, but I'm sure it's true for many other universities, although I would actually be very interested to compare and contrast the kinds of TA opportunities that are available at other institutions. I would say also if the PI or the PI lab that you're applying to has research funds, then generally there are GAs or RAs available. And that's another way of getting a sort of full payment, if you will, through graduate school. So there are multiple options. I mean, no one really goes to grad school, master's or PhD, self-funded. I think it's really important to look out for advertised research opportunities and to target the person who matches the best with your research interests, and then look for what kind of funding options might be available at that institution. But I'd be interested to hear other people's perspective because, is obviously my own experience, but I'm sure there are many different experiences across the US.
So here at CSU at Colorado State University, we do have TA-ships, and then individual professors have RA-ships. One thing that I would emphasize is that you have to be persistent. We get lots and lots of emails. Almost every week, we have people asking about paid master's or PhD research with us. And so a few things is don't give up. If you email them and they don't respond, they might just be really busy. It might be a really bad week, and then your email falls down. The other thing that I would suggest, I don't see a lot of students doing is calling us. I mean, nobody ever calls anymore. And so it's sort of interesting to get a phone call from somebody. And the first thing you would ask, is this a good time to call you? Because usually we're running off to some meeting or teaching, but then set up a time with them and say, really, if you have 20 minutes over the next 6 to 8 weeks to chat with me. Everybody has 20 minutes in 8 weeks. Most people do, maybe not everybody, but most people will have to say yes to that. And then just be persistent. You know, a lot of times it might not work out the first year because we don't have the funding, or, you know, in our case, we just switched how we're allocating TA ships. But keep the line of communication open, and they also might refer you to some of their colleagues who have positions open as well.
Maybe I'll go after Jen here. Yeah, I mean, I think this is a really good question, and I think this is one of the areas that being, you know, from a underrepresented group or being first generation, like things can get hindered because you don't know the culture. So I think it's really great SCBNA is doing this and allowing these kinds of questions for clarification. Issues about funding is difficult one because it varies institution to institution and country to country. So you're asking an American case, which I know less than in the Canadian case, but I think there are some similarities. One thing to watch out for is, and this is kind of ideal for everyone involved, if you land your own stipend or scholarship, if you're self-funded, if you reach out to a prof saying I'm self-funded, that's gonna make them take note, right? So, and that gives you a lot of options. I think if throughout this session, I think the thing I'm going to come back to is have options. That's gonna be the best for you. If you can't get self-funded, I'm not sure exactly in the US what options there are for that. I think probably through NSF. In Canada, we have a number of federal agencies that students can apply funding for. Usually it's based on your last 2 years of your undergraduate grades, if you're competitive or not. If you can't find that, yeah, reach out to profs. Sometimes, like for example, I'm recruiting for a master's right now. I've ads out, but you know, if you're a student that's not used to the system, where are you going to find the ad, right? But reach out to profs, and I'd say if you do reach out to profs, yeah, be persistent, and also keep in mind that we do get tons of emails, and we get a lot of emails that are essentially essays from students who are interested, and that can be hard to try to get back to. So if you are interested and you want to send an email, be concise and really show how your interest converges with that professor's. So don't have kind of a generic template that you're copy pasting and just listing random articles they've written. Take the time, get to know the work they're doing, think about, does your interest overlap and how? And if that kind of thoughtfulness shows through, that hooks me, and then I'm willing to chat with the student. Otherwise, yeah, TA ships, RA ships. Also keep in mind that generally funding for grad students is not great. And if you live in, like I live in Victoria, British Columbia, Canada, this is an expensive place to live. And if you're ready from kind of a cash strap background, the funding I can offer you, or the funding that you can get for being a grad student, is not going to be easy for you to live. So just keep that in mind also.
So I guess the one thing that I'll say, first I'll echo that point that in those emails, it's really important to show the fit and the match and that you've thought about it. I would say that, I mean, I just started, and yeah, I probably get an email a week, and I would say that so far, all except one made it clear like why my lab was where they wanted to end up. And so I think that's really important to not just like copy and paste the form letter. In terms of funding, the other thing that I can speak to a little bit is that there's differences in terms of fields and departments. So I was in biology departments through my PhD, which it was very common to have full tuition waiver and a TA position. I've shifted to natural resources where RA work is more common than TA. There's just not TA funding very frequently, both in terms of where I did my postdoc and where I now am in terms of faculty. And so keeping those kind of pieces in mind, there are pros and cons to both. You know, if you're looking to be in academia, sometimes having those TA positions and that teaching experience can be really great. It can also make for a longer road to finishing your dissertation though, than if you are straight up on an RA. So if you're thinking more about like finishing a graduate degree and going not for profit or agency work, sometimes those RA options might be a little bit more desirable for you. So I'd think about like what of those two paths would be worthwhile. The other point that I'll mention, because it's great to have options, but I know that it can be expensive to be like sending transcripts and GRE scores and stuff like that around. And so some places no longer require the GRE, so that's kind of a perk. And a lot of places do offer application waivers, in particular if you're coming from like a lower economic bracket. So I would seek those out too, to make sure that like you're not spending money that you don't necessarily have to be spending, to provide yourself with as many options as possible. Because the last thing you want to do is have the single option and maybe go someplace where it's like, you know, a partial tuition waiver and the TA support doesn't really match the cost of living, and all of a sudden you find yourself like going further into student loan debt for your degree. In some cases that can't be avoided, but I'd really encourage you to like try and find out what those options might be for you and try and minimize what can actually be like a pretty long-term, you know, financial burden if you don't have the options to pick from.
All right. If none of our panelists have anything else to add, I was going to take one of the questions from the form, the Google form, because it relates to some of what Brett was bringing up in the previous comment. So, let's see, what was it? Okay, so that says there's been lots of talk lately about people who are unhappy or leaving academia due to stress from financial issues or the publish or perish mindset, the lack of tenure track positions long term. What would you say to students who are concerned about this, and what makes somebody have a good experience or a bad experience in this field?
I can start with that. So I would just say, you know, when I started as a junior faculty member at the University of New Orleans, I was absolutely terrified because I had no idea how I was going to build a research program or generate funding. And I would say that startups really help because they give you like 2 or 3 years to breathe and figure out where it is that you want to develop your research program. But one of the great emphases on our job, and I'm sure you're well familiar with this, is that you have to write grants and you have to learn how to write grants. And I would just say any practice that you can get before you move into academia is terribly important. So, you know, all of the students in our program are really encouraged to write grants. And even if they don't get funded, it gives you an idea about how you can go about, you know, funding your research and pushing it forward, because funding research, you know, research funding is limited, unfortunately, and it's very competitive. But generally, it's also very rewarding. I have to say, I've always been very happy with my job. I mean, I've been working at UNO now for 20 years, and it's been an enriching experience. But as people were saying earlier, it just pays to be really persistent and also not to give up. If you get rejected, you know, whether it's a publication or a grant, you just have to keep going. Yeah. And I would like to talk more about international students at some point whenever we move on to that, because that's something I have quite a lot of experience in.
Yeah, I see one of the upcoming questions people are asking about international students, so maybe that'll be the next one. Maybe I'm priming Anna here, but before we go there, I'll add to that. And I think what Nicholas presented is yeah, I mean, if you're if you know what you want to have as a research career, yeah, I'd agree with Nicola. Like it does pay to be persistent. But I would say before you even go down that route, you have to be clear what you want to do and what you want to get out of the work you do in your future, because an academic position isn't necessarily going to provide that. So if you're thinking that you want to contribute to conservation on the ground or public policy or something like that, a lot of times an academic position actually isn't well suited for that. So it's worth really considering what it is you want to work towards. And there's a lot of reasons to really sit down and think about what you want your future to be before you jump into this. One, because the academic landscape has changed in the last few decades, the job market. So in North America, the job market has essentially flattened to decline in terms of number of job opportunities and openings since the 90s. There are fewer openings all the time. A lot of institutions aren't even replacing retirees all the time. So it's and we have an increasing glut of PhDs looking for academic positions. So it's an increasingly competitive space. And a lot of times decisions are made that are outside of your control, right? So it's worth keeping in mind. The other thing I would say is that a lot of jobs, actually the sweet spot in terms of opportunities comes through a master's. If you get a PhD, sometimes you become overqualified for positions. I've met a number of senior directors in Canadian and American government agencies who explicitly told me is that they typically don't look at PhDs if they apply for positions, partly because PhDs can get very over-specific in their specialty and they kind of get trained out of more strategic ways of thinking and get really analytical. And so a master's can open up in some ways the most diverse fields to you. And I would actually say if you are considering a research career, but you're not quite sure, start with either an undergrad RA-ship or a master's and don't jump into a PhD right away, because a PhD is a massive commitment. If you don't know if you want to do it, don't get into it unless you really know what you're doing it for.
I would add that there's different types of master's programs out there. So there's the traditional research-based masters, which in the United States would look at something like 2 years, but that includes courses. And then you do your field research typically in the summer, but sometimes it goes on longer than that for some. And then there's these practitioner-based master's programs that sometimes are 2 years, sometimes they're even shorter. They might be 18 months. And they're trained at more of a generalist level. So you might not become, very narrow in your understanding of certain concepts. But you're still going to have like this good understanding of conservation science, right? And a lot of places like generalists, because I just was talking to a student today who just graduated with a master's. She got a job as a program manager. I said, what are you going to work on? She said, everything. And she was really excited about that. So I think you really need to, get out there and see what you enjoy. If you love the research, then by all means, do the research-based master's. But if you're looking for another type of experience where maybe, one day you're working on water issues, the next day you're working on reforestation, those generalist master's programs are really good.
I guess the one thing that I'll add is just that, like, once you figure out what you want, really spend some time looking at what the requirements are for those positions and understanding that job market, and whether that's the academic job market or otherwise. But like, once I decided, if possible, I'd like to swing and try and land an academic position, I found out like what goes into application packets, and I started identifying like what I needed to do outside of like the classroom and my TA responsibilities to try and like build the skills to get there. And so for any career, I think it's really important to like sit down and try and figure out like what are those actual skills and things that you need to develop for your career. You know, so for me, it was like I sat down and it was like, okay, as someone recently on the job market, it's like, well, I need a research statement, a diversity statement, a teaching statement. You know, I have my CV and my cover letter. What goes into each of these? And because I did that early on in my PhD, I was able to figure out like, oh, here's where I need to improve myself and make sure to spend some time better understanding the expectations for those who are trying to land these positions. And I think you can apply that strategy to other careers besides academia too. It's just like taking that moment to really spend some time like browsing jobs, ideally well before you're on the actual job market.
All right, great. Yeah,
Well,
go
can I
ahead,
just
Jared.
quickly,
Yeah.
just on the professional master's thing, I think that's a really good point. But just remember so the professional masters are one area where universities are actually expanding. So in a lot of ways, universities are contracting across North America, I think especially in the US right now. But professional masters is the opposite. And a big reason for that is, and so professional masters are growing, but research-based masters, I think in the US, is opportunities for that are shrinking. Universities are putting less emphasis on research masters, partly because typically universities get less government funding to support masters than PhDs, so they get more grants if they have more PhD students. But professionals are different. They are shorter, they give you great experience, but they're way more expensive. So remember that, and you typically don't get any kind of stipends to offset your tuition for professional masters. Universities increase professional masters programs partly as a way to raise tuition for themselves. So they're definitely a revenue generator for universities.
I would agree that professional masters are a revenue generator, and we've actually undergone the same kind of transition, I think, that many other universities have done, where we created a non-thesis master's option. But I would also say that when we hire students, we're not looking to see whether they're master's or PhD applicants. I think what we're really looking for is, you know, all the things that we talked about earlier, the motivation, their interest and match with a potential advisor. I don't choose people because they want to do a master's degree or a PhD, but I also think, and I did not take a master's degree before I did my PhD, but I wish I had, which is why I ended up doing it after my PhD. I would not be put off, but at the same time, I would say if you are signing up for a PhD program, you know, be aware of the commitment that requires. It's a 4 or 5 year commitment, especially in the States, not in the UK. And be prepared for the long haul. But if you're just trying to dabble in research and figure out whether this is something you want to do or not, then a master's degree is actually a very good option.
All right. I'd like to make sure we have time to get to these questions about international students, so we can go ahead and move on to those. So what tips or advice do you have for international students in general, especially from low-income countries? And are these students evaluated similarly to American or Canadian students in your experience?
Well, I can start if you like.
Yeah, I was going to say, Nicola, you're the one who wanted to jump on that.
Yeah, so I, have, as you know, worked extensively in Central Africa, and I had a Japanese PhD student successfully complete his PhD here in the US. There are a lot of language barriers, there are a lot of cultural barriers, depending on where you're coming from. There are all kinds of obstacles that you need to be able to surmount, like, for example, the TOEFL, getting equivalency in your application process with the grades that you have and how they translate into American GPA. But you shouldn't be put off. I think, again, it's just really down to establishing a really good connection with a potential advisor. So I'm considering taking on another Japanese student, and I've had 2 Japanese students come through my lab. I think the willingness is there. It's just and the help should be there, because I think that international students generally need a lot more help than domestic students for a variety of reasons. But don't be afraid to do it if that's what you want. But going back to all the things that we just said before, establishing a good match between the PhD advisor and the prospective student is incredibly important. And when people sort of write me random emails saying, yeah, I'd really like to work in your lab and I work in marine biotechnology, I'm like, well, did you actually look at my web page? Because that's clearly not what I work in, you know. And then transitioning, somebody made a point here, transitioning from the UK to the US. So I did that. But my circumstances were a little different because I did my PhD in Britain and then I came over to the US and did my master's here. Again, it's the same deal, you know, just finding a good match and working with your potential advisor to see whether you can get RA or TA support. But all of these barriers are surmountable, but I do think it's particularly challenging for students whose first language is English. And right now I'm sponsoring a student to take English language classes so they can come up to the level of a TOEFL, because it is very challenging, you know, not only because you might have to teach, but you also might have to, well, you would have to take classes in English and people are not going to slow down. And I've struggled working in a Francophone environment for 30 years, so I know how difficult it is. So encouragement, but also commitment, I think, on that level. I'm not sure if that really answers your question, but that's my kind of perspective.
I can just add, there are certain schools, at least in the United States, that really cater to bringing in lots of students from all around the world. I did my PhD at University of Florida, and I was in the Tropical Conservation Development Program, and they're really dedicated to bringing in students from, primarily when I was there, was East Africa and mostly Latin America. And so finding those schools that have programs and have professors who have a lot of experience working with students from abroad, I think is really beneficial. I also think those students who are in these multicultural type programs really thrive because there's a lot of learning that occurs just within the cohorts as you move through the different courses. So some schools are much better funded and suited for these for students. And so finding which ones are by networking and talking to people in SCB, I think that's really key.
Travis, you want to go, or I can go now?
You can go. I'll just add that, you know, the support does vary a lot. I'm at a place right now where international students, like the tuition waivers, operate just like domestic, where if you're on an RA or TA, it's fine and pretty straightforward. But like one of the previous universities I was at, like the support for international students is really poor. Basically, you get like a partial tuition waiver that brings it down to like the domestic cost, and you have to pay the domestic cost. It becomes a little bit more of like a headache. And so, you know, if you have a strong connection with a PI, like they might have some flexibility to potentially like pay you a little bit more. Some places have caps on how much TAs and RAs pay. Other places, at least usually with RAs, you have more flexibility with how much you might pay to help offset that. So that connection is still important. But I would say, like, I agree with a lot of the stuff that I'm hearing, and don't have a ton to add for this one.
Yeah, I would say, I guess more from the Canadian perspective, but I think to some degree, both in Canada and the US, I think increasingly universities want more international students, especially, I mean, both graduate and undergraduate, for a variety of reasons. Again, partly because of long-term funding cuts from public sectors. They want to increase revenue and they can charge more for international students. So in Canada, I would say, so in Canada specifically, I think every university has an internationalization office. So if you're an international student, you're thinking of applying to university, go look at the international office. There's an office in place to try to help you come to the university. Essentially, they'll help set you up with, kind of walk you through the visa process. They'll walk you through the all the different requirements, try to help hunt down funding and what have you. The visa stuff is one thing to really consider. I know in the past few years, Canadian universities actually benefited tremendously because of America and the so-called Trump bump, because the US restricted visas from several countries. Canadian universities largely benefited. So a lot of students who would otherwise go to the US ended up coming to Canada. Many Canadian universities are actively looking for more international students, and they're increasingly creating supports to help do that. So that's what I would add, is if you're interested, yeah, go look in the internationalization office, but also be really on top of all the kind of visa and immigration aspects, as well as everything that's been brought up already. And super quick, just to end, if I'm evaluating students, no, I don't necessarily think of international students any differently. I'm taking on right now about 3 new students in the next year, and 2 of the 3 are international, and maybe 3 of the 3 will. So yeah.
But if I could just add something to that, I mean, I agree. I mean, I welcome international students, and I think many people on my university do. But I think you really need to establish that connection with your potential advisor first, because all that sort of bureaucracy that you need to go through in order to be admitted is really sort of obviously a necessary part of the whole process, but it's not the deciding factor. And there are, you know, ways and means for us to be able to help prospective international students, but that connection does need to be made first.
Super quick, just to add on to what Nicola's saying, because it's a really good point. I see Brett has a comment here about they have a dream of working in Venezuela on mangroves and oysters. Brett, I would say actually that sets you up really well. If you have a supervisor in mind who, you know, works on similar areas or works in Venezuela or you know, similar area in Latin America maybe. If you have a pretty solid idea of what you want to do, oh, that's so good for the supervisor, because that takes a lot of burden off of them. It shows the supervisor also that you're really passionate about something, which is something we really look out for. Also, yeah, so actually you're kind of ahead of things. Mostly right now you have to find fit, you have to find a match, I'd say.
And I would actually agree entirely with Gerald. The worst thing you can do is just write to someone saying, "Oh, interested in conservation," but not really specifying where. And that's where kind of past experience really kicks in, because you can say, well, you know, I've always had a passion for mangrove. Maybe you've been involved in local restoration efforts in, you know, in the Gulf of Mexico or whatever. But just showing where your past experience led you to think about where you wanted to take your graduate career is incredibly important. So I'll end it at that.
Yeah, I think it's a good time to transition into, you know, into Brett's question. I think Gerald and Nikki have done a good job starting addressing that. Is there anything else that any of the panelists want to add about that question? How do you go from being an undergrad to doing international exciting conservation work?
I'll just add my own little piece here, which might be a little bit different, which is that so I am at a land grant university in the United States. So for those who are not aware, that they were specifically designed to like serve the people and the land where the university was formed. And so this is where like having those conversations about fit up front are really important, and shows me that someone's thought about things, because I still have projects like in the Western US for my postdoc, and like some of those systems are not just going to all of a sudden disappear where I'm going to like sever all those ties or anything. But there's an expectation for me that like, you know, I have to sit down and do extra reports that talk about how I'm helping folks in North Dakota, either directly or indirectly, and things like that. And so again, it's really important, like spend some time checking out the publications of the person you want to reach out to. If they have a personal website, like check out what some of their active projects are, because the last thing you want to do is like take the time to say read some papers and then say email someone like me, like, hey, I want to do landscape genetics in mangrove forest, we're like, well, I can help you with landscape genetics, but I can't really do mangrove forest work, both in terms of my background with the natural history of the system, but also the expectations of my position, specifically because I'm in a natural resource department at the land grant, where there is this expectation that's a bit higher than, say, in your standard biology department, that the conservation work needs to be regional to some extent. At least some of the projects have to be.
I'll add a few ideas around going from being an undergraduate to, and if you want to do international work, which I actually did, I joined the Peace Corps after undergrad, and that really helped me. When people went to evaluate my application, they knew that I had lived abroad, that I could work abroad and negotiate and speak other languages as well. That flexibility to be flexible, because things are always changing when you're working, doing research, right? And so that might be a way in, and they do pay you. It's not a lot. They will put any loans you have on hold while you're in the Peace Corps, and then they give you a small stipend after you get done. So for those of you who don't have the means to, pay for those types of internship experiences that cost a lot of money typically for students, Peace Corps is a great opportunity. And I would also add, for the US, if you want to do something like AmeriCorps as well, that's looked upon highly as well. And then if you're coming in from other countries, there's other programs in other countries that are very similar to the US Peace Corps.
Yeah, and I would just like to add, so one of the things I do in my conservation biology class now is do like a special session on how to find a job in environmental sciences, because I think a lot of students just don't understand the options that are out there. I mean, there's a whole wealth, a plethora of opportunity now. I mean, subscribing to eVol Directory is a really great place to start, because they advertise a lot of post-bac research opportunities that sometimes, not always, are funded, but it's a good start to consider. The Society for Conservation Biology job board has a whole range of opportunities. The Student Conservation Association will place you in a national park or national monument or wherever across the United States where you can get valuable research experience, which is paid, or educational experience, or whatever the position is that you're applying for. So there's a lot of opportunity, and this is what I keep saying to all my undergrads over and over again. Just put yourself out there, start looking at some of these resources, apply for them, get the money or not, the stipend at least, and get the experience, and then start thinking about grad school. Because I think that sometimes people are just in too much of a hurry to get into graduate school. And here in the US, you have a lot of time to develop your ideas. In the UK, it's a lot different, but in the US, it's definitely a time, once you graduate from your first degree, to really kind of test the waters, as I said before. And there's a lot of paid or semi-paid positions out there. And also be willing to travel, because a lot of times people kind of get a bit stuck in their own neighborhood. And I think sometimes just being able to move out of that neighborhood, work in a different environment. Also, volunteering is so important. All these experiences that, I volunteered for years before I got a job in conservation, so I highly recommend it.
All right, so we are running a little bit short on time. I'll say I can stay later, but I don't want to make anyone stay later who's not available. So let's just try and quickly answer these last couple of questions that came in on the chat, kind of all together. And then if we have time to talk more, great. If not, that's fine. So where do you typically advertise open graduate positions is one. When you're talking about making connections with advisors, are you talking about cold emailing to express interest and to say that you're applying at the school? And then do undergraduate students need publications to get a good graduate position? And what about master students looking for PhDs? So whichever panelists want to answer whichever one of those, go for it.
I can go, I guess. First, yeah, I'm looking through the questions here. Making a connection with a potential advisor, yeah. You take the leap, to do the cold call. I mean, there's also a lot of professors are on social media in different ways too, and you can try reaching out that way. If you're in the same city, drop by their office, give them a phone call, a lot of different ways. And for job boards, yeah, check in with SCB NA, why not? Partly though, a lot of how academia operates is through social networks. So it's partly why it's kind of insular. So I mean, so when ads go out, oftentimes colleagues will send it to colleagues and say, hey, spread this through your network. That can be a hard way to get ads to reach undergrads. And often, like if a student asks me, I get students asking me all the time about grad opportunities, I'll attach my ad to them. So if you're interested, take the initial step. That's going to solve a lot. And then do you need publications? No, I mean, it depends on the professor. But honestly, for graduate level, it's I think Nicola made this point earlier. It's the connection with the graduate supervisor more than anything. There will be institutional and departmental requirements, but in the end, it's the supervisor that makes the call. So if they're looking for someone with specific skills, they'll let you know. But if you don't have a publication, to me, it's crazy the way that academia has escalated in the publisher perish culture. When I was an undergrad looking to grad school, it was never a question of do I need publications or not, and it's kind of crazy that that's kind of a consideration on people's minds now, that an undergrad should think that they'd have to have a publication under their belt to already do grad school. I mean, that's what grad school is supposed to train you for. So don't let that discourage you if you don't have a publication already.
Yeah.
Also, sorry, go ahead, Travis.
Okay. I was just going to add that, yeah, I agree with the publication comment, because if you think about it, for those who don't know, like publications take time to get things through the pipeline with reviews and everything. And so the only way an undergrad really has potentially publications is if like they were really like neck deep in research by like early junior year at the latest, potentially, like, that summer between your junior and senior year, like that publication potentially might not be out unless you work or do something or volunteer, do something else post graduating. So I personally would not expect an undergraduate or even potentially a master's, because it's like you defend your thesis, then there's going to be some time to actually like get that through the pipeline. The publisher perish mindset like is unfortunately very much there, and so I'm not going to sit here and pretend that like if you contact certain folks they don't have that expectation, but keep in mind too like what that might imply about your own experience being in that lab in terms of expectations. Like I know I personally reached out to someone for a PhD and they basically said your letters of rec can't come from where you did your master's degree because it's not prestigious enough and you need rec letters all from your undergrad. And I was like, but I have all this research experience and like all this stuff from my master's, and it seemed like none of that mattered. And I made the decision there. I was like, well, this probably wouldn't be a good fit for me if like prestige plays such a large role in their recruitment practices. So I would keep that in mind, that like when you're trying to find a lab, it's not just about trying to find someone who wants you, but make sure you're going somewhere that you want in terms of like their research culture, and that you're not diving into something where, maybe they expect you to throw your work-life balance out the window and things like that and make you miserable. Like try and do your best to have conversations with existing grad students that are in those labs and try and figure out like what the expectations are before you go in. And I think this expectation that you must have publications from your undergrad, to me, would be a little bit of a red flag.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I think, especially looking at the last few years and how slow things are moving through the pipeline. Yeah, I agree with a lot of what you said, Travis. And I think the other thing to think about is you want to work with nice people, right? So talk to students in those labs and make sure that the values, and you mentioned this, align? How often are they working all the time? Do you have time to actually talk to the PI? Sometimes there's not a lot of communication with folks that come in at the master's level. It's only with PhD students in the lab. So ask those types of questions. What's the culture of the lab? How often do you get together? Do you meet very often? When do you get one-on-one time with the PI? Those are all important things to consider.
All right, great. If nobody else has anything to add, we can go ahead and wrap things up.
Really quick,
oh
I
yeah,
just
go for
sent I just sent Megan an email, so Megan can pass around a student ad for me. So if any of you are interested, there'll be that at least.
Oh, great.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
can, well, oh, so Anna, you were maybe gonna mention this, but I can stick this in the follow-up to this webinar to folks. I'll share Gerald's ad.
Yeah, that'd be great. And I can add whatever whatever resources anyone has that wants to be shared, whatever was in the chat. That'd be good. All right, well, before we all sign off, I just wanted to say thank you again to our panelists and also to Megan, who's been really, really helpful in organizing all this and getting the word out. And thanks everyone for showing up and being here. It's been really great.
Thank you for organizing.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
And thanks for the folks who hopped on. And I'll just add too that I think Anna, in your flyer, like I think you had, our names and whatnot, and I'm happy to take emails and chat with folks outside of, beyond this point. So I'm happy to do that. I'll also likely be, I haven't posted the thing officially yet, but have some like master student opportunities. So yeah, just don't hesitate to reach out. And I'm happy to help however I can.
Yeah, same here.
Great, yeah.
Happy to have my email shared and have people reach out.
Yeah, if any of you want to put your emails in the chat, that's an option.
Still looking, my computer's kind of playing up, but I'm looking for the file that has all the job opportunities that I have. So can I send it to you and can you send it out to the group? Would that be okay?
Yeah. Yeah, I think we're going to be able to send a follow-up email, so that should work. All right. Well, if no one has any last things to add, I'll go ahead and end the meeting. All right. Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye.